A black man carried an old stranger through the storm. The next morning, everything changed by sunrise. 12 black SUVs were parked outside the narrow brick house where Elijah Brooks lived, and the same police officer who had threatened to arrest him the night before was standing in the rain with his hat pressed nervously against his chest. Neighbors watched from behind curtains. A television crew waited across the street. Men in dark coats spoke quietly into their sleeves while a silver-haired woman stood beside the lead vehicle, staring at Elijah's front door as though the entire future of the city waited behind it. None of them knew that only 10 hours earlier, Elijah had been walking home with $9 in his pocket, a torn work jacket on his back, and no idea whether he would still have a job by morning. None of them had seen him kneel in the middle of a flooded road. None of them had heard the old stranger whisper a name that powerful people had spent years trying to bury. And none of them understood why Elijah Brooks, a man the city barely noticed, had carried that stranger through the storm. The night before, rain struck Briarwood like thrown gravel. It hammered rooftops, swallowed traffic lights, and turned the streets into dark rivers that rushed along the curbs. Wind bent the sycamore trees until their branches scraped against windows. Sirens echoed somewhere beyond the old railway line, rising and falling beneath the thunder. Elijah stood beneath the narrow awning of Bellamy Grand Hotel, watching wealthy guests disappear into polished cars. Water dripped from the edge of the awning and struck the pavement inches from his boots. His shift had ended 11 minutes earlier. He should have been on the number 16 bus, heading south toward the small house he shared with his mother and his 12-year-old daughter, Nia. But the bus service had been suspended because of flooding, and the hotel's assistant manager had refused to let employees wait inside the lobby. "Guests can see you," Mr. Harlan had said. Elijah had glanced at the marble floor behind him. "I work here. Your shift is over." Harlan's eyes had moved over Elijah's faded uniform and damp collar. He lowered his voice, although two white bellmen stood close enough to hear. "The lobby is for paying customers." For a moment, Elijah said nothing. He could feel the familiar heat rise behind his ribs. Not anger exactly. Something older. Something heavier. The exhaustion of being treated like a stain in a building he helped keep spotless. One of the bellmen looked away. The other pretended to adjust a luggage cart. Elijah reached into his locker, pulled on his worn brown jacket, and stepped outside without arguing. He had learned long ago that some men used rules like locked doors. The more dignity you showed, the more they wanted to see you pound against them. So Elijah did not pound. He simply walked away. By the time he reached Lexington Avenue, the rain had soaked through his jacket. His shoes made soft sucking sounds against the pavement. He kept one hand inside his pocket, wrapped around the crumpled $9 he had saved for groceries. At home, Nia would be waiting with her science book open on the kitchen table. His mother, Ruth, would pretend she had eaten dinner even if she had not. The refrigerator held half a carton of milk, 3 eggs, and a bowl of rice covered with plastic wrap. Elijah had counted them that morning. He counted everything now. Rent, bus fare, medication, school lunches, hours left in the week, days until the electric bill was due. Still, when he passed a convenience store glowing weakly through the rain, he stopped beneath its flickering sign. Inside, an old man stood at the counter holding a paper cup of coffee and a packet of crackers. His gray coat was too thin for the weather, and his hands trembled as he searched his pockets. The cashier sighed. "You're short." The old man looked down at the coins in his palm. "How much?" $2.14. The line behind him shifted impatiently. Elijah entered, dripping onto the tile. He placed $3 on the counter. The cashier looked at him, then at the soaked hotel uniform beneath his jacket. "You sure?" Elijah nodded. The old man turned slowly. His face was narrow, his eyes pale and sharp beneath thick silver eyebrows. He studied Elijah with an intensity that felt almost uncomfortable. "You don't know me," he said. "No, sir." "Then why?" Elijah glanced through the rain-streaked window. "Because you're hungry." The old man's mouth moved slightly, but no words came. Elijah picked up the coffee and crackers and placed them in his hands. "Find somewhere dry." Then he left before the man could thank him. Outside, the storm had grown louder. A transformer burst somewhere in the distance, painting the clouds blue for half a second. The streetlights along Lexington flickered and went dark one after another. Elijah pulled his hood up and kept walking. 3 blocks later, he saw the barricade. A section of Madison Street had flooded beneath the railway bridge. Brown water rushed over the road, carrying branches, bottles, and pieces of trash. Two police cruisers blocked one side, their lights spinning red and blue across the rain. An officer stood beneath a plastic poncho, waving cars away. "You can't cross," he called. "I'm on foot." "Then you especially can't cross." Elijah looked toward the distant hill. Going around would add nearly 4 miles. "My house is on Mercer." "Not my problem." Elijah stared at the water. The officer stepped closer. "You deaf?" "No, sir." "Then move." Elijah lowered his eyes and turned away. He took the longer route through the old warehouse district, where the buildings leaned over the road like tired men. Rainwater poured from rusted gutters. Broken windows flashed white whenever lightning split the sky. The streets were almost empty. Near the abandoned Harrington textile mill, Elijah heard something beneath the storm. A voice. Thin. Distant. He stopped. The wind pushed hard against his back. For a moment, there was only rain striking sheet metal. Then he heard it again. "Help!" Elijah turned toward the mill. A chain-link gate hung open. Beyond it, weeds bent beneath the water. The old loading yard had become a shallow lake, black and rippling under the lightning. "Hello!" Elijah shouted. No answer. He stepped through the gate. Water climbed over his boots. Near the far wall, a shadow moved beside a collapsed section of fence. Elijah hurried closer and found an old man lying in the mud, one leg trapped beneath a fallen wooden beam. It was the same man from the convenience store. His coffee cup floated upside down nearby. Blood ran from a cut above his eyebrow. Elijah dropped to his knees. "Sir, can you hear me?" The old man opened his eyes. "You. Don't move." Elijah gripped the beam and pulled. It did not lift. The old man gasped through clenched teeth. "My leg." "I know. Stay with me." Elijah tried again, bracing one boot against the wall. The wetwood shifted an inch, then fell back. Lightning cracked overhead. The old man's face had gone gray. Elijah reached for his phone. No signal. He looked toward the street. The mill stood too far from the main road for anyone to hear. "How long have you been here?" "I don't know." "What happened?" "A car." The old man swallowed. "They forced me off the road." Elijah looked at him. "Who?" The old man's eyes moved toward the darkness beyond the fence. Before he could answer, headlights appeared at the end of the yard. A black sedan rolled slowly through the gate. Elijah stood. The car stopped 20 yards away. Its headlights burned through the rain. The old man grabbed Elijah's wrist with surprising strength. "Don't let them take me." Elijah looked down. "What?" The rear door of the sedan opened. Two men stepped out wearing dark raincoats. One was broad-shouldered and bald. The other had a thin face and held an umbrella, though the wind kept twisting it sideways. The bald man called out, "Step away from him." Elijah did not move. "You know this man?" he asked. "He's confused. We're taking him home." The old man's fingers tightened around Elijah's wrist. "No," the bald man moved closer. "This doesn't concern you." Elijah glanced at the injured stranger. Rain streamed down the old man's face, mixing with blood. "What's his name?" Elijah asked. The men stopped. The thin-faced man lowered his umbrella. "You need to leave." "That wasn't my question." The bald man smiled without warmth. "You want trouble?" "No, then walk away." Elijah looked toward the street. He was alone. No cameras. No witnesses. No one who would believe his version of what happened if these men decided to make him the problem. He thought of Nia sitting at the kitchen table. He thought of Ruth waiting by the window. He thought of the $9 reduced to $6. He thought of Mr. Harlan telling him the lobby was for paying customers. Then he looked at the old man trapped in the mud. "What's your name, sir?" Elijah asked. The stranger's lips trembled. "Arthur." The bald man's expression changed. Elijah heard it. Not surprise. Recognition. The stranger had told the truth. The men knew him. Elijah bent beside the beam again. "Get away from him," the bald man said. Elijah slipped his hands beneath the wet wood. "You should listen," the thin-faced man warned. Elijah pulled. Pain shot through his lower back. The beam shifted. The old man cried out. One of the men began moving toward them. Elijah pulled harder. For one long second, the beam rose just high enough. "Move your leg," Elijah shouted. Arthur dragged himself free. The beam crashed down. Elijah grabbed him beneath the arms and lifted. Arthur could not stand. The bald man reached inside his coat. Elijah did not wait to see what he was reaching for. He swung Arthur onto his back. The old man was lighter than he looked, but his wet clothes pressed down like sandbags. Elijah locked his arms beneath Arthur's knees and ran toward the broken side fence. Stop! A hand caught the back of Elijah's jacket. The fabric tore at the shoulder. Elijah stumbled, nearly dropping Arthur. He spun and drove his elbow backward. It struck something solid. A man grunted. Then Elijah was through the fence. He ran into the alley behind the mill. Arthur's breath came in painful bursts against his neck. Where? Elijah asked. No police. What? No police. You need a hospital. They'll find me. Elijah turned a corner. Behind them, footsteps splashed through the water. A trash container stood against a warehouse wall. Elijah ducked behind it and crouched, still holding Arthur. The men ran past the alley entrance. Elijah stayed completely still. His lungs burned. Arthur's hand rested against Elijah's chest. The fingers trembled. After several seconds, the footsteps faded. Elijah looked down the alley and saw the narrow brick tower of St. Matthew's Church 2 blocks away. The church had been closed for years, but its basement sometimes opened during winter storms as an emergency shelter. Can you hold on? Arthur nodded weakly. Elijah lifted him higher and stepped back into the rain. Each block felt longer than the last. Water rose to Elijah's ankles, then his shins. Wind pressed Arthur's weight against him. His injured shoulder screamed beneath the torn jacket. At the church, the basement door was locked. Elijah pounded on it. Hello? Nothing. He pounded again. A small window above the door flickered with light. A moment later, the lock turned. A woman in a red sweater opened the door. She was in her 60s, with close-cropped white hair and a flashlight tucked beneath one arm. Elijah. Miss Cora, help me. She stepped aside quickly. Inside, the basement smelled of dust, candle wax, and wet coats. 6 people sat on folding chairs beneath battery-powered lanterns. A mother held a sleeping child. 2 elderly men played cards beside a portable heater. Elijah lowered Arthur onto a cot. Miss Cora knelt beside him. What happened? His leg was trapped. You call an ambulance? No signal. She examined the wound above Arthur's eye and then touched his ankle. It may be broken. Arthur grabbed her sleeve. No hospital. Miss Cora looked at Elijah. Elijah shook his head slightly. Some men were chasing him. The room went quiet. One of the card players stood. Men. Black sedan, Elijah said. 2 of them. Miss Cora closed the curtain around the cot. Everyone in this room saw nothing. No one argued. She cleaned Arthur's cut while Elijah stood nearby, water dripping from his clothes and forming a dark pool on the floor. Arthur watched him. You should go home, he said. Elijah glanced at the rain striking the small basement window. I will. They may come here. Then you shouldn't be alone. Arthur's pale eyes held his. Why are you doing this? Elijah let out a tired breath. You already asked me that. And you still haven't answered. Elijah looked toward the mother holding her child. My father died when I was 16, he said quietly. Heart attack at a bus stop. People walked around him because they thought he was drunk. Arthur said nothing. He had his work uniform on. Name stitched on the chest. Lunchbox beside him. Still, nobody stopped until it was too late. The rain pressed against the window. Elijah lowered his voice. I decided a long time ago I would never walk around someone who needed help. Arthur closed his eyes. Miss Cora wrapped his ankle tightly. You'll need a doctor by morning, she said. Arthur opened his eyes again. If I survive until morning. The words changed the air. Elijah pulled a chair beside the cot. Tell me what's happening. Arthur studied the other people in the basement. Then he looked at Miss Cora. Can we speak privately? She drew the curtain fully closed. Arthur reached inside his coat. Elijah tensed. But the old man withdrew a small brass key attached to a black cord. This opens a deposit box at First Briarwood Bank, he said. Box 117. Elijah stared at it. In that box are documents, recordings, payment ledgers, and copies of private communications. They prove that 3 city officials, 2 judges, and the executive board of Bellamy Development have been stealing public land for nearly a decade. Elijah's expression hardened at the name. Bellamy. Arthur nodded. They buy condemned properties through shell companies. Then the city clears poor families out, sells the land for almost nothing, and Bellamy redevelops it using public money. Elijah thought of boarded-up houses in his neighborhood. He thought of rent increases. He thought of the pharmacy closing, the laundromat disappearing, families packing their belongings into borrowed trucks. What does that have to do with you? Arthur looked toward the curtain. My full name is Arthur Bellamy. Elijah went still. The hotel, the development company, the silver name carved above half the city's newest buildings. Arthur watched the realization move across his face. I founded Bellamy Group 42 years ago. Elijah slowly sat down. I thought Arthur Bellamy was dead. That story has been useful to certain people. Who? My son. Arthur's voice barely rose above the storm. Charles Bellamy controls the company now. Publicly, he is a philanthropist. Privately, he has turned everything I built into a machine that feeds on people who cannot fight back. Elijah remembered the lobby lights reflected on polished marble. He remembered Harlan's face. Why didn't you stop him? I tried. Arthur looked down at his hands. I spent years believing I could correct him quietly. I thought blood created loyalty. I thought shame would bring him back to himself. His fingers closed. I was wrong. A hard knock sounded above them. Everyone froze. Another knock. Then a man's voice from outside. Police. Miss Cora looked at Elijah. Arthur's face drained of color. Elijah stood and moved toward the curtain. Wait here. He climbed the basement steps. Miss Cora followed. Through the small glass pane, they saw two police officers beneath the awning. One was the same officer who had blocked Madison Street. Elijah opened the inner door, but kept the security chain fastened. The officer shined a flashlight into his face. You Elijah Brooks? Elijah's stomach tightened. Yes. We're looking for an elderly man. White male. Gray coat. Injured. Why? Missing person report. Who reported him missing? The officer's eyes narrowed. Open the door. Miss Cora stepped beside Elijah. This is private property. We have reason to believe a kidnapping victim is inside. Elijah almost laughed, but there was no humor in him. Kidnapping. The second officer lifted a hand toward his radio. The first officer leaned closer to the glass. Brooks, you have a record. Elijah felt Miss Cora turn toward him. A misdemeanor from 19 years ago, he said. I was 18. Assault. I pushed a man who hit my sister. The officer smiled. Open the door before this gets worse. Behind Elijah, a floorboard creaked. Arthur stood halfway up the basement stairs, one hand gripping the rail. No, he said. The officer's expression changed. Arthur raised his voice. I am not missing, and Mr. Brooks did not kidnap me. Sir, step outside. I will do no such thing. We need to verify you're safe. Arthur looked at Elijah. The meaning was clear. If he opened the door, they would take him. Elijah kept his hand on the chain. The officer's smile disappeared. You're obstructing an investigation. No, Elijah said. I'm protecting a man who says he's in danger. From whom? Elijah looked directly into the officer's eyes. Maybe you. For a second, no one moved. Rainwater streamed from the officer's hat. Then he struck the door with his palm. You have no idea what you're stepping into. Elijah's voice remained calm. I know exactly where I'm standing. The officer pointed at him through the glass. You'll lose your job. You'll lose that house on Mercer. You'll lose your little girl. Elijah's hand tightened on the doorframe. The threat was too specific. Arthur heard it too. Miss Cora whispered, Elijah. He did not look away. The officer stepped back. We'll return with a warrant. The two men disappeared into the rain. Elijah locked the deadbolt. When he turned, Arthur was staring at him. They know where your daughter lives. I heard. I'm sorry. Elijah pulled out his phone. 1 week Barr had appeared. He called home. Nia answered on the first ring. Dad, you okay? Grandma and me are fine. The lights went out, but we have candles. Elijah closed his eyes briefly. Listen to me. Lock the back door and stay away from the windows. Why? Just do it. Dad, what happened? I'm helping someone. There was silence on the line. Nia knew that sentence. She had heard it many times. When Elijah drove a neighbor to the emergency room. When he stayed late to fix Miss Cora's heater. When he spent Christmas Eve searching for a lost child in the park. Are you in trouble? She asked. Elijah looked at Arthur. Maybe. Nia breathed quietly. Then come home. I will. You promise? Elijah's throat tightened. I promise. He ended the call. Arthur lowered himself onto the cot. There's another way, he said. He explained that the bank opened at 8:30. The evidence in the deposit box had to be delivered to a federal prosecutor named Helen Ward. She had been investigating municipal corruption, but lacked proof strong enough to act. Arthur had arranged to meet her that night. The car had forced him off the road before he could reach the meeting. They know about the box, he said. They don't know which branch. Elijah looked. At the brass key. Then we go in the morning. You don't have to. No, Elijah said. But I'm going. Before dawn, the storm weakened to a steady rain. Miss Cora found dry clothes for Arthur and gave Elijah an old green coat that had once belonged to her husband. The sleeves were short, but it was warm. At 6:15, Elijah called the hotel. Mr. Harlan answered. You're late. My shift starts at 7. You were scheduled early for storm cleanup. No one told me. Well, I'm telling you now. Elijah glanced at Arthur asleep on the cot. I can't come in. Harlan paused. You can't. I have an emergency. You people always have emergencies. Elijah's jaw tightened. What does that mean? You know what it means. You're unreliable. I've missed one shift in 3 years. And now you're missing another. It's one shift. It's your job. Elijah stepped away from the cot. My mother needs her medication. My daughter needs school shoes. I know what this job means. Then get here. Elijah looked through the basement window. The rain had softened. A pale line of morning touched the clouds. I can't. Harlan exhaled slowly. Then don't come back. The call ended. Elijah stood with the phone against his ear. No shouting. No argument. Only the quiet sound of rain dripping from the church roof. Arthur had awakened. You lost your job. Elijah put the phone away. Looks like it. Because of me. Because of a man who was waiting for an excuse. Arthur studied him. You should be angry. I am. You don't sound angry. Elijah looked at him. Anger is expensive. I've got too many other bills. At 7, Miss Cora borrowed a delivery van from the church pantry. The heater barely worked, and one windshield wiper dragged across the glass with a painful rubber squeal. Elijah helped Arthur into the passenger seat. They had traveled less than a mile when a police cruiser appeared behind them. No siren. Just lights. Elijah checked the mirror. Arthur turned in his seat. Keep driving. They'll use that against us. They'll use anything. The cruiser's lights began flashing. Elijah pulled to the curb. The same officer approached. He tapped the window. Out of the vehicle. Elijah lowered the glass halfway. Why? Stolen van. It belongs to St. Matthew's. Out. Arthur leaned across the console. Officer, I have already told you. Sir, stay inside. The officer opened Elijah's door. Elijah stepped out slowly. Rain touched his face. The officer placed a hand against his chest and pushed him toward the van. You're under arrest for vehicle theft and unlawful restraint. That's a lie, Arthur shouted. The officer grabbed Elijah's wrist. A second cruiser stopped behind them. 2 more officers emerged. People watched from a bus shelter across the street. One young woman raised her phone. The officer saw her. Put that away. She did not. Elijah kept his hands visible. I am not resisting. The officer twisted his arm higher. Pain cut through Elijah's injured shoulder. His knees struck the wet pavement. Arthur forced open the passenger door and tried to stand. He fell. The sound of his body striking the road changed everything. The woman at the bus shelter screamed. Elijah turned sharply. Arthur. The officer pressed him face down. Rainwater filled Elijah's mouth. Stay still. Arthur lay beside the van, clutching his chest. The second officer knelt beside him. He's not breathing right. Call an ambulance. The first officer hesitated. Call it. Elijah shouted. The officer drove a knee into his back. Shut your mouth. Elijah's cheek pressed against cold asphalt. Across the street, the woman kept filming. Arthur lifted one trembling hand. Elijah. I'm here. Key. Elijah felt the brass key beneath his shirt, where Arthur had placed it before they left. Don't speak. Tell Helen. You're going to tell her yourself. Arthur's eyes found his. Kindness is not weakness. His hand fell. The ambulance arrived 6 minutes later. By then, the video was already online. It showed Elijah lying in the street. It showed Arthur collapsing. It showed an officer ordering witnesses to stop recording. What it did not show was the key hidden beneath Elijah's shirt. At the hospital, Elijah sat handcuffed to a metal bench while doctors examined Arthur behind locked doors. Officer Grant, the man from the flooded bridge, stood nearby, speaking quietly on his phone. Yes, he said. We have him. He glanced at Elijah. No, the old man is still alive. Elijah looked down. Grant lowered his voice. We didn't find it. The key. They were searching for the key. A nurse walked past pushing a cart. She was a black woman in her 40s, with tired eyes and purple-framed glasses. As she approached, Elijah let the brass key slide from beneath his sleeve. It struck the floor with a soft click. The nurse looked down. Elijah covered it with his shoe. Their eyes met. "Ma'am," he said, "I need to use the restroom." Officer Grant turned. "You can wait." The nurse studied Elijah's face. Then she looked at the blood soaking through his torn shoulder. "He may have a dislocation," she said. "I need to examine him. He's in custody. He's also in my hospital." Grant stepped closer. "This is police business." The nurse did not move. "And that is a medical injury." For several seconds, they stared at each other. Then Grant unlocked the cuff from the bench and attached it to Elijah's wrist. 5 minutes. The nurse led Elijah into an examination room. She shut the door. "What are you mixed up in?" she whispered. Elijah removed the key from beneath his shoe. "Do you know Helen Ward?" The nurse's expression shifted. "The federal prosecutor? I need this delivered to her." She stared at the key. "Why me?" "Because that officer is afraid of it." The nurse looked toward the door. "You don't even know my name." Elijah's voice softened. "No, but you looked at me like a person." Something moved across her face. She took the key. "My name is Danielle." "Elijah." "I know. The video is everywhere." Footsteps approached. Danielle placed the key inside the lining of her shoe. The door opened. Officer Grant entered. "Time's up." Elijah left with him. At 9:17, Helen Ward walked into First Briarwood Bank carrying a federal warrant. Danielle walked beside her. At 9:42, Box 117 was opened. At 10:05, 3 federal teams left the courthouse garage. At 10:20, officers entered Bellamy Development Headquarters. At 10:37, Charles Bellamy was removed from a board meeting in handcuffs. Cameras caught the moment. His silver tie hung crooked. His mouth opened and closed while agents carried boxes past him. At 10:50, Officer Grant was arrested in the hospital parking lot. At 11:14, Mr. Harlan stood in the Bellamy Grand Lobby watching the news on a guest's phone. The report showed Elijah's photograph beside the words "key witness." Harlan's face lost its color. At 11:30, the handcuffs were removed from Elijah's wrists. Helen Ward met him in a small hospital conference room. She was a composed woman in a navy suit, with dark hair threaded by gray and a voice that did not waste words. "Mr. Brooks, Arthur Bellamy is alive." Elijah closed his eyes. The breath left him slowly. He suffered a cardiac episode, but the doctors expect him to recover. "Can I see him?" "In a moment." Helen placed a thick folder on the table. "What you helped deliver may be the largest public corruption case in this city's history." Elijah looked at the folder. "How many people?" "We don't know yet." "How many families lost their homes?" Helen paused. "Thousands." The word entered the room like cold air. Elijah thought of neighbors forced away, children changing schools, elderly tenants standing on sidewalks beside furniture. He pressed his palms against the table. They knew. Yes. And they kept doing it. Yes. Helen watched him carefully. Arthur spent years gathering evidence. Last night, he intended to turn it over and testify publicly. Why didn't he do it earlier? You'll have to ask him. Elijah looked through the narrow window in the door. 2 federal agents stood outside. "What happens to my family?" "They are under protection." "My mother?" "Safe." "My daughter?" "Safe." The tension left Elijah's shoulders so suddenly that his body began to shake. He lowered his head. He had held himself together in the mill, in the church, on the road, under the officer's knee. But at the word safe, something inside him broke open. He covered his face with both hands. No sound came at first. Then one. Small. Ragged. Human. Helen turned toward the window, giving him privacy without leaving. When Elijah finally lowered his hands, she slid a box of tissues across the table. He almost smiled. "My daughter hates when I cry." "Why?" "She thinks fathers are supposed to know what to do." Helen's expression softened. "Most children eventually learn we don't." A nurse entered. "Mr. Bellamy is asking for him." Arthur lay beneath white blankets in a private room. Without the coat, without the rain, he seemed smaller. Tubes ran beneath his nose. A monitor pulsed green beside him. Elijah stood in the doorway. Arthur opened his eyes. "You made it." "So did you." Elijah walked closer. For a while, neither spoke. Morning light filtered through the blinds, pale and clean after the storm. Arthur looked at the bruises on Elijah's wrist. "I did that to you." "No, my name did." Elijah pulled a chair beside the bed. "Your son did." Arthur looked toward the window. "I taught him that winning mattered more than listening." I taught him that power meant never bending. When he was young, he cried easily. I told him tears were weakness. His mouth tightened. Eventually, he stopped crying. Elijah said nothing. Arthur's eyes shone. I thought I had made him strong. The monitor continued its soft, steady rhythm. You made him afraid, Elijah said. Arthur looked at him. The words were not cruel. That made them harder to escape. Arthur closed his eyes. Yes. Elijah sat quietly. After a while, Arthur spoke again. I can compensate you. I don't want compensation. You lost your job. I'll find another. You were assaulted. So were a lot of people who never had cameras nearby. Arthur looked at him for a long time. What do you want? Elijah leaned back in the chair. He thought about the empty pharmacy, the rising rents, the children who crossed 3 dangerous streets because their neighborhood school had closed. He thought about Bellamy Grand, where employees ate in a windowless basement while guests wasted untouched food beneath chandeliers. I want you to listen, he said. Arthur nodded. So Elijah told him. He spoke about Mercer Street, about the families living beneath eviction notices, about his mother cutting pills in half to make prescriptions last longer, about hotel workers denied sick leave, about security guards following black teenagers through stores, about city meetings held at times working people could not attend, about how humiliation often arrived quietly, disguised as procedure. Arthur listened. He did not interrupt. When Elijah finished, the room was full of afternoon light. Arthur's voice came softly. I built towers because I wanted the city to remember my name. Elijah looked out at the skyline. Cities don't remember names. What do they remember? How people were treated inside them. Arthur turned his face toward the window. A week later, Elijah returned to Bellamy Grand. He did not come through the service entrance. Helen Ward walked beside him through the main doors. The marble lobby gleamed beneath the chandeliers. Guests turned to look. Employees stopped behind desks and luggage carts. Mr. Harlan waited near the fountain. His suit was perfectly pressed, but sweat darkened the collar. Elijah, he said, stepping forward. There's been a terrible misunderstanding. Elijah looked at him. Harlan lowered his voice. I had no idea what was happening. You knew you fired me. I was under pressure. You knew you sent me into a storm. The hotel has policies. Elijah glanced around the lobby. The same floor. The same lights. The same cold shine. What do you want me to say? Harlan whispered. Elijah studied the fear in his face. A week earlier, he might have imagined this moment differently. He might have imagined Harlan humiliated in front of everyone. He might have wanted the man to feel small. But standing there, Elijah felt no victory. Only tiredness. I want you to remember how easy it was, he said. Harlan swallowed. What? To look at me every day and never see me. Elijah walked past him. Behind the reception desk, one of the bellmen, the one who had looked away that night, lowered his eyes. Elijah stopped. The young man's face tightened. I'm sorry, he whispered. For what? For doing nothing. Elijah looked at him. The apology was quiet. Unprotected. Real. Then do something next time, Elijah said. The young man nodded. In the ballroom, hundreds of hotel employees waited beneath rows of warm lights. Arthur Bellamy entered in a wheelchair. The room fell. Silent. He was still weak, but his voice carried. He announced that Bellamy Group would place $3 billion in assets into a public restitution trust. Properties acquired through fraud would be returned where possible. Displaced families would receive legal support and compensation. Employees across Bellamy companies would gain representation on workplace councils, paid medical leave, transparent promotion standards, and independent channels for reporting discrimination. Then Arthur looked at Elijah. I spent most of my life believing strength was the ability to control a room, he said. I was wrong. The employees listened. Arthur's hands trembled slightly on the arms of his chair. Strength is carrying someone when you owe them nothing. A few people began to cry. Elijah stood near the side wall, uncomfortable beneath the attention. Arthur invited him onto the stage. Elijah shook his head. Arthur waited. The room waited. Finally, Nia slipped her hand into her father's. She had come with Ruth, wearing her best blue sweater and white sneakers polished until they shone. Go, she whispered. Elijah looked down at her. You hate when I stand in front of people. I hate when you pretend you're not brave. He smiled despite himself. Then he walked toward the stage. The applause rose slowly. Not explosive, not theatrical. It began with the kitchen workers, then the housekeepers, then the security guards. The reception staff, the drivers, the people who entered through side doors, cleaned rooms they could never afford, and disappeared before guests learned their names. Elijah stepped onto the stage. Arthur held out his hand. Elijah looked at it. Then he took it. The applause grew louder. If this moment touched your heart, remember Elijah's choice. He did not stop because the stranger was wealthy. He stopped because the stranger was human. And sometimes the smallest act of compassion is the first stone removed from a wall that has stood for generations. When the room became quiet again, Elijah faced the employees. He had no prepared speech, no polished words. He looked at the people in uniforms like the one he used to wear. I don't think one good deed changes the world, he said. The room remained still. But it changes what happens next. That was all. He stepped away from the microphone. 3 months later, the first Mercer Community Clinic opened inside a building Bellamy Development had once planned to convert into luxury apartments. Ruth received her medication there without paying. Nia joined a weekend science program in the room upstairs. Miss Cora ran the food pantry from the ground floor. Danielle volunteered twice a month, though she insisted she was not a hero. Helen Ward's investigation continued. 4 judges resigned. 2 council members were convicted. Officer Grant pleaded guilty to conspiracy, obstruction, and assault. Charles Bellamy went to trial. Mr. Harlan was removed from hotel management, but Elijah asked that he not be publicly humiliated. Instead, he was required to testify about discriminatory employment practices and attend every restitution hearing involving former hotel workers. Some people called that mercy. Elijah did not. Mercy, to him, did not mean avoiding consequences. It meant refusing to become cruel while demanding them. Arthur visited Mercer Street on a cold morning in early spring. He walked with a cane now. Elijah found him standing across from the clinic, watching children paint a mural on the brick wall. The image showed many hands lifting a small house above floodwater. Arthur wore the same gray coat from the night of the storm. It had been cleaned and repaired, though one dark stain remained near the cuff. You kept it, Elijah said. Arthur looked at the coat. I needed the reminder. They stood side by side. Across the street, Nia laughed as blue paint touched the end of her nose. Arthur watched her. She has your eyes. She has her mother's stubbornness. Where is her mother? Elijah's smile faded gently. Gone 6 years. I'm sorry. Elijah nodded. The wind carried the smell of wet earth and fresh paint. Arthur looked toward the mural. Do you ever wish you had walked past me? Elijah took his time answering. I wish it hadn't cost so much. That isn't the same. No. Arthur's hand tightened around the cane. I would understand if you hated me. Elijah watched a little boy stretch upward with a paintbrush. You're asking the wrong question. Arthur turned. The question isn't whether I hate you. It's what you do now that you know what your silence cost. Arthur absorbed the words. Then he nodded. The clinic door opened behind them. Ruth stepped outside carrying 2 cups of coffee. She handed one to Arthur. He accepted it with both hands. You look familiar, she said. Arthur glanced at Elijah. We met during a storm. Ruth studied him for a moment, then smiled. My son collects lost people. Elijah laughed quietly. I do not. You brought home 3 dogs, 2 children, a wounded pigeon, and Mr. Gaines. Mr. Gaines was not lost. He was asleep in a grocery cart. He was tired. Arthur's laugh came unexpectedly. It was rough from disuse, but warm. Ruth looked pleased with herself. The 3 of them stood beneath the morning sun while children painted the wall. No reporters had been invited. No cameras waited across the street. No one applauded. Several weeks later, another storm crossed Briarwood. Not as violent as the first, but strong enough to darken the afternoon and send people hurrying beneath umbrellas. Elijah was leaving the clinic when he noticed a young delivery driver struggling beside a stalled van. Cars moved around him. Drivers honked. Rain poured from the sky. Elijah stopped beneath the awning. For half a second, he thought of home. Warm food. Dry clothes. Nia waiting with a movie. Then he stepped into the rain. The delivery driver looked up as Elijah approached. I'm fine, he said quickly. Elijah glanced at the water rising around the tires. No, you're not. Together, they pushed the van toward higher ground. Inside the clinic, Arthur stood near the window. He had come for a board meeting, but stayed behind when the rain began. Through the glass, he watched Elijah brace both hands against the back of the van. His coat darkened beneath the water. His shoes slipped once, then found the pavement again. Arthur reached for an umbrella. He hesitated. Then he left it behind. He opened the door and walked into the storm. Elijah looked over as the old man placed both hands against the van beside him. "You'll ruin that coat," Elijah said. Arthur leaned forward. "It has survived worse." The two men pushed. The wheels turned slowly. Rain ran down their faces. The van rolled free. The young driver climbed behind the wheel and lifted one hand in gratitude before pulling away. Elijah and Arthur remained in the road. For a moment, neither spoke. The storm softened. Sunlight broke through a narrow opening in the clouds and touched the wet street. Every drop on the pavement caught the light, turning the road into a sheet of trembling gold. Across from them, the clinic windows glowed. Inside, Ruth was setting out coffee. Nia pressed both palms against the glass. Elijah lifted his hand. Arthur lifted his too. Then they walked toward the open door together, leaving two sets of footprints in the rainwater behind them. One broad, one unsteady, side by side. And as the storm passed over Briarwood, the city kept moving around those footprints without knowing how much had changed because one man had refused to walk past a stranger.